I'm going to go ahead and get us started for the evening. Looks like we have 27 or so families out there, and we may get more as the evening goes on. And so that's absolutely fine. I want to take just a second before we get started too much and allow the panel's members to introduce themselves. So I'll start. I'll say my name is David Nunez. I am the head of school. And I use he, him pronouns. I'm also a parent at the school. So I do have 2 kids at the school, my son and my stepchild. So I will pass it on to Matt.
Sure. Matt McElrath, he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Dean of Students, and I work with grades 1 through 12. Pass it off to Adam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Kohler. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Upper Adolescent Program Director, and I'll pass it over to Jean.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jean Peters. I'm the Elementary Program Director, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'll pass it over to Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Hartjes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Special Education Director at Great River. I'm going to pass to Stacy.
Hi, I'm Stacy Krieger. I am the Director of Administration, and I use she, her pronouns. That's everybody, right? Yes.
That's everybody. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists for coming tonight. Thank you to Stacy for moderating. I'm going to speak to that in just a second here. And thank you all to the attendees who were able to come tonight. So really appreciate having you all here. You do have, just so you all know, basically the way the evening is going to work is that I'm going to speak for a little bit. I'm going to ask maybe a couple panelists to speak for a little bit. And then there's going to be an opportunity to ask some questions. You have on the bottom of your screen, you should have a button that allows you, I believe it's called Q&A. And if you click on the Q&A, you can specifically enter questions into the Q&A. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second when I talk about the format of, why we chose webinar specifically. But this is a webinar. And tonight I want to speak to, just to be clear and upfront, I want to speak to the issues of hate speech and also issues of sexual harassment that have come up recently at Great River. And I want to speak to our response to these particular situations, to our policies. I'm going to invite Matt McElrath as Dean of Students to speak to our practices around student discipline and restorative practices at Great River. And I want to talk about our plans moving forward as well, given everything that's happened in recent weeks. I also want to thank everybody who's come to speak to me individually or in groups over the last couple of weeks, students, parents, a wide range of people have come to staff, have come to talk to me about the situation. And I want to thank everyone for all the phone calls and emails I've gotten. I know that I haven't gotten back to everybody. I do apologize for that. I'm answering them as fast as is humanly possible, but there has been an absolute flood of emails and calls, and I am doing my best to both run the school at the same time as trying to get back to people. So I apologize if I haven't gotten back to you specifically. I do hope to either still be able to get back to you or possibly to be able to answer your questions tonight in a way that makes that possibly unnecessary. So as I said earlier, we're in a webinar format tonight, and there's a couple reasons for that. The main reason is that we did have an issue last year with some Zoom bombing at a Zoom meeting. And so we want to be real cautious about any sort of public posting of a meeting and not allow something like that to happen again. And so that's why we use the webinar format mostly. But I also want to speak to the fact that I would, and I apologize for that sound in the background, that's my G-chat going off. That'll probably ring a few times through the meeting, so I apologize. But I also want to speak to the fact that we do have to uphold certain laws and practices, especially when we're talking about particular situations. And so I ask that no one use any student names in their questions tonight, or I'll speak to what we can and cannot say about the situations that have come up recently. But I ask if you do type something into the Q&A not to use any specifics, specifically student names around concerns that you might have. We are protecting people's privacy as the law requires. And if you do use a student name in the Q&A, your question might be deleted, honestly. But it also could be that we don't get quite a chance to answer all the questions tonight. And so what I did at the last webinar session that we had last week is we went ahead and recorded all of the questions, and we reported out both the questions that I was able to answer, and also we reported out to the questions that I wasn't able to get to. I was able to type a response and get those out to the community. So we're recording tonight's session, and we will also be getting out answers to any questions that we're unable to get to tonight. We have until just about 7 o'clock, so we have a little bit of time here. As I said, I will definitely save time for questions. So make sure that you think of your questions and type them into that Q&A. As far as these situations go, I want to upfront state that, we do have a discipline plan at our school. We have behavior and classroom management approach that is holistic and humanistic and relationship-based. And we use the philosophy of restitution to train our guides in specific tools and to support students in returning to the community when something has happened, and restoring that community very specifically. So when students engage in behaviors of any kind, there's sort of parallel structures. There are consequences to their behavior. And separate from that, separate from those consequences, there's also this deep philosophy of setting conditions in which we validate the needs of students, review the behaviors that they've been engaged in, and encourage students to make choices to self-manage their behavior. And we do have clear rules, just to be absolutely upfront. I know most of you know that, but we have expectations and we have consequences when behaviors happen in the school that maybe violate certain boundaries. What I can speak to today is GRS's response, or what I'm planning on speaking to is GRS's response, and specifically our response to hate speech and sexual harassment. Now, to be clear, I can't go into the details of a particular student situation or how a particular student was possibly punished based on choices and behaviors that they may have made. And I get that that's frustrating to some. People want to know what happened when community norms have been broken. But everybody has rights, and rights to privacy and rights to due process, no matter what they've done. So as I've told the students, I came to the community meeting, the upper adolescent community and lower adolescent community meetings recently. And I was very clear. I told them, we won't be trying these situations that have come up recently in the court of public opinion. That's not our job. As the staff in the building, the people who are in front of you tonight on this panel, it's our job to respond to these situations as they come to light, and as they have come to light in the past few weeks. And we have to follow the law in how we respond. I'm sure many of you may be thinking about specific situations, whether they're the situations that recently led to this school sit-in, or situations having to do with yourself if you're a student, or your child, or whoever you are as a caregiver in the community. And if you have a specific situation that you want to follow up with us on, I would say that you should reach out to Matt and I so that we can reply privately. And so we won't be using student names. We won't be talking about the particulars. And if you use names in your comments, like I said, we may not be able to answer your question in order to protect people's privacy. Members of this leadership team and other members of the leadership team who weren't able to join tonight as well, over the past few weeks, we've been meeting, and there's some things that we want to share with you tonight. Also know, though, I have to say up front that me coming to talk to you tonight is not, I believe, the end of these conversations, right? That this is in many cases Maybe not the beginning, because we have been having these conversations with students. We've been having them in community meetings. We've been talking with staff. Maybe the second step in the process is where we're at. And so we do have a long process in front of us to potentially address situations that have come up recently. And first of all, I also want to say, I think I've said first of all like 3 times, so I apologize. I also want to say that I know many of you are upset about situations recently involving hate speech and involving sexual harassment in the building. And I think that those feelings are absolutely justified, and hate speech is never acceptable. And questions about sexual harassment, this is also never acceptable in our building. And we're terribly sorry that this has happened. And I just want to have said that and said that out loud to everybody. What I hear from students, though, as members of the community, honestly, is quite a bit of frustration and pain about how these issues have been handled in the past. And so I hear from students that it's not entirely about the situations that have come up recently. But it's about a history of how it has been perceived that the school responds. And I think that frustration comes, at least in part, from a lack of transparency around the process. So if you don't know what's happening when something happens in the building that makes you uncomfortable or unhappy or angry or frightened, if you don't know what's happening, how can you feel good that anything is happening, right? And so that's part of our process here tonight, is to discuss, what does it look like when things happen around the building, to be really clear with everybody on what our process is. We have, in my mind, I sort of think about where we are right now and where we have to be and where we're going to be moving forward in 3 sort of stages. And this is exactly what I said to students when I met with the community meetings specifically. I think sort of the short term, the immediate response, what are we doing right now? Because there is an urgency around this work that is incredibly important. And so what are the things that we're doing right now? I'm going to speak to tonight. I also think about maybe less immediate, but still soon, kind of a medium term. What are we doing over the course of the coming weeks around repair, around restorative work? We'll speak to all of those things. And then finally, I also think about sort of a long range response, the type of work that we're going to be needing to be working on for a long time in order to address issues of justice and address issues of equity in our building. And so I'll speak to those tonight too, and opportunities along this process for everyone to potentially participate too. I'll start with the short term, and I'm going to speak a little bit, and then I'm going to invite Matt to speak here too, because I think it directly relates to that immediate response, the work that he does so consistently in the building. So in the short term, the first thing that we're doing is investigation, to be totally honest. Anything that hasn't been investigated, we will be investigating. And we've been doing our best to investigate all the different claims and allegations and concerns that students have brought to us. And I committed to students too at the community meetings that we will continue to investigate. And if there are things that we haven't investigated yet, we want to know about them because we want to investigate them. We want to know if we can get to the bottom of any of these situations that maybe has hurt someone in the building. Also, students have been and will continue to deal with the consequences of their choices, to be punished for situations where they violate our school policies. And Matt's going to speak a little bit to what those sorts of consequences look like. And also, we've been talking as a community, and I think we're going to continue to talk. The idea of having an assembly was brought to me several times. So we brought it to community meetings, we brought it to advisories. And that's part and only part of the conversations that we're going to be having, conversations that we'll continue to have as an entire community. So if you have had the opportunity to be heard and to speak and to listen, that's wonderful. And if you haven't, we hope to continue to provide those opportunities for everyone. So that's what I think of about immediately about the immediate response to the situations. I'm going to take a pause here for just a moment, and I'm going to introduce Matt McElrath to speak specifically about discipline and about restorative justice practices and restitution practices at Great River. So Matt, I'm going to hand it to you for just a few minutes, and then I'll come back.
Sure. David, before I get started, maybe a quick back and forth with you and me. Should I plan to project any slides here or talk without them?
I was going to project the slides that you sent me, so I will put those up right now if that works for you.
Yep, totally. Okay, so I, again, introduce myself, and I've seen the attendance count rise since we first got started. So my name is Matt McElrath, he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Dean of Students, and I work with students 1st through 12th grade. So on one hand, I'm going to give some very general information that just speaks to our practices school-wide with 120 faculty members and about 750 students, and how we respond in terms of our philosophy, our practices, and restorative practices. And then I can speak more directly to some of the things that I know that the questions that have led to this webinar. And so I was speaking with the student experience subcommittee of the board last week. And so it was kind of specific about responses and restorative practices. But as I prepared some of the slides, I think it's worthwhile to say, this is something that we spend almost 2 days on for new faculty orientation in August, and then several hours on with returning faculty. And so we spend probably more than half the time talking about the theory of and philosophy of restitution. And so restitution is actually something that has been developed, and it's intentionally used in schools. And there's a day's worth of training that I go through to talk about where this comes from and the science behind it and the research behind it. But if I were to talk about it in a nutshell, it's essentially saying that all human behavior is driven by needs, so whether that's survival needs or social needs or competency needs or other types of needs, we recognize that every single student and adult that comes into our building needs to have their needs met at school, or they're going to be struggling and dysregulated, not able to engage in learning. And that we generally recognize that needs can be met in both positive ways and ways that might harm the community. So we say everybody should have their needs met when they come to school. And when we talk about community and when we talk about the importance of relationships, that's one of the things that we mean. And so we can't really find out what a student's needs are without having a relationship with that student. And so if something's happening, pretty much every faculty member is trained to say, what do I know about this student? Do I have a relationship with them? And if not, I probably need to get to know them before I can even make some guesses about what the student might need. So that being said, that doesn't mean that there are no rules or boundaries or anything until that relationship happens, but they're essentially equally important. And so again, that's the theory behind restitution. And we also then talk about community norms. And so we spend a lot of time in the first days and weeks of school saying, what does it look like to have norms of behavior in our environments, whether that's in independent work or elementary classrooms or during CAS or during advisory, all the places throughout the school. We ask for students to partner in developing community norms that also uphold their capacity to have their norms be met during the school day. And so when we talk about a holistic approach to education and discipline, that's also what we're talking about. And when we're talking about restorative practices, we're also thinking about what both the community's needs are and what the individual's needs are. So again, happy to take a lot more conversations about that, but I think it's really important to say that is our philosophy. And we spend a full day talking about that before we ever talk about a single rule or a consequence or a discipline, because that's really what we put first and foremost. But then, as we've been talking with students and faculty and community members about this in the last couple of weeks, we don't necessarily turn around our training materials and show students that this is exactly what we do and why we do, but there's no reason that we can't. And so that's one of the things I'm doing tonight, is just to say, as we work with 120 faculty members, this is exactly what we share with them about how to interact with students across the entire building. And we also tell faculty members we very much want them to be empowered to speak up for their community and community norms too. So it's not just me as the dean of students or the head of school or a program director or a guide who should, quote unquote, have the power to uphold these norms, but it's anybody kind of moving throughout this community. And so this also exists pretty much in parallel between the elementary and the adolescent level, both in terms of like defining behavior and then categorizing behavior and then responding to behavior and documenting behavior. So they're pretty similar systems. And essentially the major difference is that the types of behaviors and the way we define them are different at the elementary and at the adolescent level. And so because the concerns that are bringing this to this community webinar are about the adolescent, that's what I'm going to be speaking to. And so what I'm showing you here has come from work with the adolescent faculty and just naming, as I've got here, quick math, 15 behaviors. These are the most common frequent things that we're working with. And so it's not like there aren't other categories of behavior, but these are the ones that we identify as the things that we're working with most frequently. We've worked together to say what we have as our working definitions for these. And so, it's a separate document that I won't share tonight necessarily, but it's something that I'm happy to have a conversation about as well. But faculty at the adolescent level basically are all referencing the same definitions when they're looking at this tiered behavior chart. And so then we ask faculty to kind of, as they're working with students and observing behavior, to make a judgment about what they're seeing. And so we have 3 categories from right to left. The first one is just essentially upholding our community norms by addressing it and speaking up for it, being an upstander. We also ask most of our students to play a part in holding community by also upstanding these norms. And we very much expect that they can play a role here in a way that they can't necessarily with these other 2. So these are things that we would ask the adult to just address it as they're seeing it happen. And most of the time this is, 30 seconds to a couple of minutes, and we would probably leave it there. The next category of behavior is called tracked, and we've also recognized that it's documented. So this is something that, whether it's electronically or on paper, we've got both systems based on convenience for the guide, but these are behaviors that we want to make sure that we're documenting, so we can also be tracking data over time to see if patterns emerge. So some of this behavior might be lower level, but if it persists on a daily basis all the time, it's still something that's probably interfering with that student's or another student's learning in a way that we want to support, for instance, a behavior intervention. So this level is usually something that we try to address in the moment, but also recognize we probably want to use a relationship, again, when it's not in the public eye. So if this is something happening in the classroom, it's probably something that we would want to have a conversation after class, during lunch, after school. Sometimes tensions can get escalated. And so if we aren't addressing something that's specifically connected to safety, we'll often say let's avoid this escalation and just come back to this the next day and have the conversation there. It's something that we would then be also communicating with parents, whether it's a phone call or an email, to say, this is something that happened today. We want to come back to this the next day. And as I said, as we're tracking the data and the documentation to see patterns, we're working with students to try and build skills and just find different ways to get their needs met. All these things in the yellow and orange categories are things that anybody in the building can be working with, and in most cases, the classroom guide. Anything over on the left is something that we called referred. And so when we say referred, we are referring to administration, and that's this leadership team. And we're also naming it as a bottom line behavior, something that's potentially a safety concern or an emergency or something that just needs to stop and be addressed as soon as possible. And so you'll see on the next slide, our protocol for doing that. But these are all, as we talk about harassment and hate speech, these are all things that we name as bottom line behavior. And when we see them, hear them, experience them in the community, are wanting either students and or adults to report them to administration. And so, part of our judgment and response is just is there an emergency, a crisis that we need to respond to? And we have what's called a CPI teams that use walkie-talkies. And so, if we're talking about an emergency, there can be 6 to 8 to 10 adults within a couple of minutes to a situation to support students. And these are all things that also require an investigation. So once we have established that people are safe and can either move on with their day or in a space to regulate and have a little privacy. That's when we're then looking to do an investigation with all the students involved, including all of the witnesses and adults involved. And so this is something that sometimes can take several days to put together all the information. Sometimes it's something that is pretty obvious within a half an hour, but an investigation. And then once we have all of that information, then we're essentially making a couple of determinations. What are the appropriate consequences? What are communications that are required? What is it going to take for the student to be ready to return to the learning environment? And most of the time, what kind of repair is going to be necessary, whether that's to the physical building or to relationships or to the broader community. And so I think that's where we're at with some of the conversations tonight about, what are the consequences? What is the discipline? How are things like expulsion and out of school suspension and in school suspension used in relation to any of these, again, specific bottom line behaviors? And then what do restorative practices and mediation and restorative justice look like in these situations? And so again, I can speak a lot to it, but again, the general practice is lots of mediations following this, especially if this is any kind of relational circumstance where a relationship can be repaired and or harm can be addressed. And so this is something that I'm usually working with program directors, guides, advisors, special education case managers, and especially our social workers and behavior interventionists to kind of prep students for this. So it's often several meetings before a student or a group of students is ready for a mediation. So usually we're pretty certain that the mediation is going to go well before we even host it. And our general message is to say, like, not only do we value community, but as a small school, that's also how we live. There are only so many classes, there's only so many places in the building. And so for immediate safety, we can separate students and create different schedules. But over the long term, like our way of moving through the building, moving through the school year, and literally going on key experiences where we're camping, eating, traveling together, we need to share space, and it's a value of our school to share space. So usually our restorative practices have an eye towards how can we actually be together successfully and safely in the future. And so that's probably what I wanted to speak to in a nutshell, but if there are other things that are coming up, happy to talk to them in the Q&A section. And if it's specific things now or in the past, these are things that David mentioned, we can plan to have meetings for, phone conversations, or email connection that way. Oh, I didn't say next slide, but I can say next slide and speak to that one real briefly. This one just is our protocol, and we've modified it over the years. And so this one is intentionally a reference. These two things are actually things that I have taped to the bottom of my computer. And so sometimes when I'm walking through the halls, or all the time when I'm walking through the halls talking to guides about how to interpret things, I'll just flip over my computer and say, like, what do you think this is? How would you define this? How should we be responding? And then this is just a protocol, and it starts with the recognition of, like, you as a guide or faculty member don't need to address this. If this is a serious safety concern or a bottom line behavior, please reach out and use direct communication, walkie-talkie, text, or in person, just so we can ensure immediacy. And then again, these are our materials, so we're just sharing with you, like, what's our protocol. If things aren't bottom line, then we're using relationships, classroom management strategies, as you can see, redirect, 30-second interventions, documentation and communication, and then sometimes a recognition that even if it's not an emergency situation or a bottom line behavior, it still can be really challenging, and or you don't have the relationship, but somebody else does. And so this is where we just acknowledge that the special education team, interventionists, social workers, or me can be available to come kind of tag in. And sometimes this is as simple as that lets a classroom guide and a student step into the hall to have a conversation while somebody else steps into the classroom with 25 other students, just so that it can have some immediacy. So I will hand it back to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment, but we can refer back to those documents if that's helpful at any time. So, so that's in my mind, as we think about the situations that have come up recently, sort of our short-term response, right? Like, how do we handle issues in the moment? How do we handle investigation? How do we handle safety concerns? And then you get a little bit into the restorative practices. I feel like that's more in the medium term, as I said earlier, breaking it into 3 sort of categories. The restorative work is the work we do over time to rebuild community. And restorative work is sometimes parallel to things like discipline and some of the practices that Matt was speaking to, but it's also the practices that Matt was speaking to, right? Because these are parallel practices in so many ways. And so that restitution piece happens over time, and it can take a considerable amount of time, is all I would really add to that. Also, I think that in response to the situations that have come up recently at the school, the intermediate, the medium term, another thing we're doing is this exactly. We're sharing with students the detail of our process for discipline and restitution. We're sharing with families those details. You know, we're doing this work of trying to be really transparent and trying to communicate with you all exactly what this process looks like. So that's a big piece of what we're doing as well. But then I want to speak a little bit to the long range response. And when I was speaking with students, the metaphor I used for doing work related to justice is that when you're working towards justice, that you're climbing a mountain potentially with no top, right? We're not going to solve the problems of racial injustice soon, but that doesn't mean that it isn't work that we need to do urgently now, that it isn't deeply important just because there's no end in sight. And so at Great River, I think some of the sort of long range response to the situations, one element of that is policy work. And so I invite everybody who's here tonight who might be interested to come and participate in the policy committee. I have to put that plug in because we could use some more membership in our policy committee. But also, I think it would be really great to have some students involved too. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm putting the responsibility on the students to do entirely this work, but I think having students review and comment on. We had students previously work on the dress code policy, for instance, at Great River. And so to great effect. And so having students involved in this process, I think, around a policy related to sexual harassment, around a policy related to hate speech, I think could be a very powerful thing. It is really hard work because of the nature of discipline policies, right? We have certain things that are required by law, certain policies that we have in place already, harassment and bullying and hazing, and specific policies that we are required to have. But it doesn't necessarily mean those policies can't be updated and can't be changed and adapted to meet our needs even more closely. I have heard a lot of talk around this phrase, and I just wanted to share it real quickly, some thoughts about it around this phrase, zero tolerance. Some students have come to us with this concern, you know, what is our zero tolerance policy? What do we have zero tolerance for? Zero tolerance.
Sorry, could you say that again? My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
Apparently, my computer is thinking that I'm talking to it, so I apologize about that. So sorry, zero tolerance policies are something that's brought up quite a bit recently by students. And so it's a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't mean that we are tolerating things like hate speech and sexual harassment, because we are not. But a zero tolerance policy is a phrase that specifically refers to a type of behavior policy that is entirely about punishment, honestly. It's not about acting relationally. It's not about believing that people can fundamentally change and grow. It's not about believing in restorative work. So schools that have participated, you know, when I was working on my principal's license, we went through case studies. And one of the things we talked about was zero tolerance policies. Schools that have gotten into situations with zero tolerance policies, examples that we looked at were things like students who had specific disabilities. You can imagine perhaps around speech and around things that students have said, maybe a student with Tourette's who says something that in some schools might be considered, you know, we have zero tolerance for that phrase or for that word or for that usage. And it relates to their disability. So that's one example. Another example that came up was around weapons. And of course, we immediately think, well, of course, there should be zero tolerance for weapons. Well, there was a student at a particular school who had a pocket knife in the glove compartment of their car in the parking lot because they used it at their job stocking shelves. And this particular school said, you have a weapon on campus and you are expelled because we have a zero tolerance policy. So that's the type of response that zero tolerance policies bring about. They bring about no sort of understanding of the complexity of human experience and interaction and behavior. So instead, we use that phrase that came up that Matt talked about, that bottom line behavior that is our bottom line, that we don't tolerate from JRS students. And that means there are consequences, including potential suspension, including potentially expulsion even, and also restitution and restorative justice practices. Expulsion is another area that I've gotten a lot of questions about recently, and I just want to be really clear about it. Expulsion is defined in Minnesota very explicitly in what's called the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act. It's a law that protects due process rights for students. And to be clear, an expulsion is a legal process that a school board can possibly participate in. It's not even something that a head of school has the power to do. I cannot expel a student by myself. A school board can exclude or expel a student after holding a formal hearing that has to be conducted by an impartial official. Their hearing procedures, written notice, it has to be within 10 days of the situation. There can be an extension possibly, but there has to be at a particular time and place. There has to be an impartial hearing official. There has to be a hearing record. There's some very strict rules about what an expulsion actually looks like in the state of Minnesota. And a school board or a student may appeal, and then that goes to the education commissioner and has judicial review. So it actually goes before a judge potentially if a student appeals an expulsion. So not a simple process. And honestly, an expulsion in the state of Minnesota also means that the administrator must create a readmission plan, because an expulsion stands for 1 calendar year in the state of Minnesota. So it's not what most people think of when they think of the phrase expulsion or what it means to be expelled from school. It's a little more complicated than that. There are situations, for example, bringing a firearm to school, in which pretty much in every situation an expulsion would be legally required. So there are situations where an expulsion could take place at Great River. I'm not going to say that we never expel students, but also it hasn't happened because it's a complicated process, because we work with students, because we're so relational, because of how we approach discipline. There's a range of sort of moving pieces in potentially what that process might look like. So I just wanted to have said that too. But to get back to sort of the long-term work that we're doing outside of addressing those sorts of details, the long-term work that we're doing also includes the inclusion of more voices. And so I think that's something that we certainly can get better at, and that both in the creation of policy and around decision-making, when something like, for example, an instance of hate speech comes up, how do we include more voices in deciding what happens and in how that process looks? And so that doesn't mean that students would be necessarily involved in deciding what happens in a specific case to a specific student, but it might mean that students are involved in the policy creation. It might mean that staff are involved, and potentially more staff of color are involved in the process in responding to something like hate speech. So we're discussing that as a leadership team, and we're talking about what that might look like in terms of how we make these decisions and how we move forward with these processes. A couple things that we've done in the last few weeks, I do want to make sure I have time to answer questions, but a couple things that we've done in the last few weeks. One, we have created a new communication system in which students We had it previously, but we've updated it and changed it a little bit, in which students can anonymously report things like hate speech and sexual harassment in the school, or other instances of bullying and harassment, and that will be available to students not just electronically, but also a phone number they can call or text specifically to report those things. We're going to get some posters up after break to share with students around the school, like basically to advertise the system and to make it really clear how it works for students around the school. Also, the policy committee has taken on the review of the discipline, harassment, bullying policies. And we are meeting pretty regularly. We meet twice a month. And we're just starting that process of reviewing those policies. And it takes time, but if you want to be involved, you certainly can. The Student Experience Committee has been taking on this work, like Matt spoke to earlier. He spoke to the Students Experience Committee this last week, and they are taking on the work of, evaluating our processes and our procedures around all of this. And then another step that we've taken recently is that I've been in touch with an organization that we've worked with in the past called Equity Alliance Minnesota. And the goal this year is to bring Equity Alliance Minnesota into our building to do an equity audit of our building. And so what I believe that will include things like student surveys, student focus groups, interviews, conversations with students. But they are pretty booked as an organization. I hope to get them in as quickly as possible, but I'm going to be meeting with them in the second week of January. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, sitting down with them and setting up what does this process look like exactly at GRS and how we will be moving forward with it. You may have heard that we recently got a list of demands from a group of students. Now, I know that that list does not fully represent the demands of all students in the building, but we are doing our best to respond to some of those demands. So there was some demands around sexual harassment and the process for investigations specifically. There was a demand around anonymous reporting, which, as I said, we're putting out a system related to anonymous reporting. There was a demand to hire more educators, more BIPOC educators, more Black, Indigenous, and people of color educators, which is something that we are always working towards, and are constantly trying to come up with new methods and new ways of working in that direction. But it is very difficult, and I don't mean to make excuses at all, but there is a relatively very small number of BIPOC educators in the state of Minnesota, and there's a lot of schools out there that are trying to hire them. And so we're doing our best to recruit and support BIPOC educators when we do hire them. There were also some things around requests around the courses we offer related to IB, which we want to be very thoughtful about and respond to students. There was a question about lunch prices, which we want to be very thoughtful about and respond in full to students that relate to, budget, the lunch prices that relates to, say, budgeting issues and things like that, that I think we can be more transparent about. And we can share with students why the lunch prices look the way they do at the school and things along those lines. So we're hoping to continue to respond to all of those demands and other demands that may come up, other students that might have interest in either including other demands or other requests to the school. So as I said to the students, I'm going to wrap up by repeating a few things that I said to the students at the community meetings that I stepped into. What I said to them was that now is a time for some of us to learn and grow, for some of us to do some really deep, hard work on ourselves, for some of us to try to find healing in the face of a situation that brought out a lot of anger and indignation. But we can't let that tear apart our community, because community is worth more than that. Our community is worth more than that. We have the potential to be something so much more than that. And we have to know that we're in this together as a community. We, as staff members, we have a certain role in that process, and we do that role as best as we can, and we're always learning and growing too. And we make mistakes, and we're human beings. For students, that includes, reporting to adults. And that does include, I have to say, not participating in gossip, right? Like reporting situations to the faculty of the school is not the same thing as gossiping. And whether you do that yourself or whether you do it anonymously, it's not the same thing. But spreading rumors about others is harmful and it is hurtful, and it can even be bullying. So what I really want to wrap up with today, my last statement of the evening, will be exactly what I told students at their meeting, and that's that we hear you, that the work is not done, that it's going to take real time and effort, and that we don't have all the answers, but that we're working, and we're going to keep working, and we're going to keep talking. And that's what I have for tonight. Thank you all for listening to 47 minutes of Matt and I talking. Is there anyone else on the panel who wanted to make any comments before we get into questions? Okay. Well, we'll move into the question phase of the evening. If you have a question that you haven't had a chance to type in, remember, hit that button on the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can enter your question in there. And please do not use specific student names in any question that you might ask. So,
All right,
Stacey.
there are some good questions that have come in, not too many yet, but we'll see if we can answer as many of them as possible in the next 15 minutes or so. First one, I don't want to know who did anything, but I do want to know what the consequences are for students who use hate speech. I don't know if you answered that very super specifically in your.
Right. So hate speech is definitely in that category of bottom line behavior where it is an unsafe situation that's hurtful to others. And so, you know, we very likely would be talking about suspension. We very likely would be talking about, you know, serious consequences. We definitely would be talking about restorative practices, trying to work with that student to repair the damage that they did to others and to the community. And, you know, we could possibly, to be honest, if we're talking about repeated instances of hate speech, if we're talking about, you know, we're so relational and we're so, we respond based on the circumstances in so many ways. And so we try to be as consistent as possible. We try to respond in ways that are fair and that are just. But every situation is so unique. And so I can imagine situations involving hate speech that are so egregious that we might pursue expulsion. I have to be honest. But I have a harder time imagining that because of the nature of our organization, because of the nature of our school, because of the nature of the work we do. Working with students to come back into the community in time, working through restorative practices with students. And that's not easy work and it's not fast work, but it is the work that we're committed to doing. So.
I'm going to group a couple questions. If and when guides and staff do not acknowledge or respond quickly to bottom line behaviors, what happens? Are students able to reach out to another guide or staff member? If so, do students know what guide or staff to report this to? And then another question that's related is, will more discussion definition of sexual assault / harassment be had? Who investigates allegations if GRS doesn't?
Interesting. Good questions. So if a student feels like their concerns or allegations are not being investigated by the person that they report it to, they should certainly feel free to report it to someone else, including myself. You know, I have been meeting with students recently and I mean, generally have been meeting with students, but recently about some of the situations. And part of that comes in wanting to report things directly to me as head of school. And so I am definitely open to having that conversation. There's also situations, to be honest, where someone might not be satisfied with my response. And so there are avenues to file grievances with the board and things along those lines. So there's always avenues to pursue if you feel like you're not getting, you're not being treated fairly or equitably, I would say. At the same time, I think part of our job that is coming up recently is the fact that we need to be more transparent about the work that we are doing. And so I spoke to that a little bit earlier. But I think in a lot of cases, there actually is a lot of investigations to allegations that maybe students aren't necessarily aware of how it's playing out or how it's turning out. And so I think that it's maybe not always the case, but I do think that is one possible reason, is that sort of transparency effect too. If you don't know what's happening, you feel like maybe nothing is happening, when that's not always the case. But you are always welcome to reach out to me as head of school, and I would love to hear from any student who's got serious concerns about something that they've reported, if they feel like it hasn't been followed up on.
And can I just add on to that, David? If you are a student in the audience, I can speak specifically to the upper adolescent, but this is pretty true for lower adolescent as well. Some trusted adults who are sort of within your immediate circle. Your advisor is a fantastic person to talk to. That's one of their jobs as your advisor, is to connect you to other resources if you don't know who else to talk to. If you have a relationship with a school social worker, Ori or Seth, they are fantastic people to talk to. And then your program directors, myself and Tammy. If you already know us, we'd be happy to talk to you. If it's a little scary to talk to us, you could always send us an email. And then if you're not sure who else to talk to, that anonymous reporting can also be a fantastic place to share your concerns.
And really anybody in this Zoom, anybody on the leadership team as well. I've had students come to me as well. I think one of the things we didn't address is like sexual assault is very different than sexual harassment. And that if there were a sexual assault, that would be something that generally is criminal and reported to the police. And I think that's something that needs to be pretty clear to students as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was in the demands, I should have spoken to this earlier. There was in the demands reference to sexual assault, that were there ever a situation of sexual assault in the building, we would be involving the police, right? Like, that's the level of seriousness of something that is generally referred to as sexual assault. So often what we're dealing with is sexual harassment, and comments made by students, inappropriate comments made by students. And sometimes we're dealing with bullying, which is targeted, repeated behavior. There's different definitions for these different terms. But I certainly don't know of any situation involving a sexual assault in the building that wouldn't have been investigated. That's, yeah.
I have two questions I'm going to group together again. So the first, it seems to me that while discipline is important, and it's important for students to know what people will be held accountable, another issue is that my student seems to be very distressed about what happened and to feel like the school isn't taking it seriously. You can't feel like you're in a community when some people are being told they don't belong. Can we shift the focus to supporting students of color in new ways? Do work around the harm to them specifically? And then there was another question added recently from a student that said it seems like a lot of the focus is on helping students that said the hate speech, and what are you doing to help the students that were harmed by the hate speech?
Okay, that was a lot, so let me try to respond to that as best as I can. I can see how it feels like the restitution and restorative practices are focused on the person who has done the harm. When done right, they shouldn't be. They really should be about repairing harm to the community. And so I do really feel like restorative practices, we talk a lot about the person who's done the harm, but really the work should be around, punishment work is more around consequences, is more around the offender, and work around restorative justice should really be based on what does it take to repair that relationship, to repair that community, to repair that damage. Sometimes it's physical damage in a building, it could be damage in the broadest sense of the term. And so I think in those cases, the victims of the situation should be central to the conversation. Can you go back, Stacy, and help me remember what the rest of the question was about too?
Yes, mostly can we shift the focus to supporting the students of color in new ways? Absolutely. And do work around the harm that has been done to them specifically?
I'm going to
Yes.
raise one here and jump
Please do,
in.
Matt. Yeah.
So, my role as Dean of Students is supporting these systems, revising these systems, and implementing these systems. But it's also the Dean of Students' role to supervise the Student Services Department. And so the Student Services Department is 15 members, and most of them either work in level or across the entire school building. Generally speaking, they are academic or behavior interventionists or social workers, but there's a lot of unique roles in there too. And so there are 4 social workers at the school, more or less 1 at each level. And then there's also the Student Wellness Equity Coordinator who works with the Student Services team. And so I would say like, this is very much the Student Services team. And so we have found over time that kind of differentiating the roles and who is responding so that it's not, for instance, me as the Dean of Students that's doing all of those pieces. And so in my work, I probably work with nobody as much as the 4 school social workers. But, in ways of like supporting other students, this is where I might be working at the UA level with Seth and Asha to say like, if I'm working with the students that are connected with the investigation, who's supporting these students, and some of it's short term and some of it's longer term. So this is where we're talking about safe spaces and affinity spaces and events and ways to connect with different adults throughout the school day. And so, yeah, when we're talking about answering that question, it's often like which roles are best suited and supported, best situated to support those students.
That's similar to what I was going to speak to the SWEC role in the building and affinity spaces, speak to some of those practices that we are, I think in some ways, just starting to invest in as a community. We've been doing them for years in many ways. And also we need to continue to support and develop those practices. And so we hope that we're doing that work. And if there's other ideas about how to do that work better, I want to hear them. I really do.
This question is kind of related, so maybe expand a little bit more. Poor behavior is often due to underlying stressors and other mental concerns and conditions. What is GRS doing to promote access to student mental health resources?
Again, the 4 social workers in the building take that very seriously in their role, but I think everyone in the building does. I think we all know that, I think mental health and I think the support of mental health in the building has always been a priority. And I think given the nature of the last, whatever it is now, 23 months of pandemic in this world, everything that's been going on in our city, in our country, in our world, that's polarizing. I think there's so much going on that could potentially influence the mental health of students. And I think we're all pretty hyper aware of that and constantly trying to figure out how to better support students along those lines. So it is specifically the job of our social workers and our school psychologists and roles like that in the building, but I actually view it as the role of every single one of us, not just on this panel, but every single staff member in the building. And I think staff members would agree with me on that front too.
I think highlighting that we have 4 social workers, that is unheard of in pretty much every other school, and how much we've invested into that, with investment into additional funding that we've gotten to support that. I think the school prioritizes that more than many. Okay, I have kids who range many different grade levels and have heard from all of them that the common theme is disrespect and physical aggression on the playground is not closely regulated. What can you tell me about this? My kids told me multiple times that they don't feel adults pay attention or care what happens during recess.
Certainly invite any of the program directors who are here to speak to that, or Matt. The times that I've spent out at recess personally, I feel like that's what I've been focused on, trying to support students. And I feel like we have a lot of staff out there, but I don't want to be defensive. But I also can see where it is a place that is more chaotic, and that it is a place where students feel sort of licensed to be more chaotic. And so I can see how that is sort of a prime place for a lot of these behaviors to play out. And if we could be doing a better job at it, we should consider what we can be doing to do a better job at it. But anyone else on the panel who'd like to speak to recess more specifically?
I can speak a little bit. I think that we've been, I know there's been a lot of conversations around recess staffing and making sure that there are enough adults out there. And so I do think that is something that we've really tried to be aware of, especially at the elementary and lower adolescent levels, of really trying to get enough staff out there to support. And that was a discussion we were having as recently as last week. So I do think that's a present concern for us and something that we're addressing all the time and making sure that we have enough folks out there to support. But certainly if, I supervise many of the staff who work at recess and always urge, students who are having concerns and can address any adult that's out at recess, whether that's a classroom adult, whether that's a paraprofessional or an EA, which is what we call them in our building. I certainly encourage students to approach any adult that's out there, whether or not they work with that person to request support if there is something needed, because there are lots of children out there, but we do want to make sure that everybody's being served.
There was a clarifying question on something we addressed earlier, and I want to try to answer it properly. Perhaps I wasn't clear. How will we repair the harm to students of color, in particular Black students? How can their sense of belonging be restored after this? Well, of course, very important. I wasn't talking about mental health support, but rather community level repair.
I think it comes in the conversations we're having. I think it comes in the affinity spaces that we make available to students. I think it comes in, spending on equity issues in the school in terms of putting our money where our mouth is. Are we really invested in equity as a school, in training staff, in hiring staff, in all of that sort of work? And I don't think there's a quick answer to that question, but I think that we're dedicated to doing the work in all fronts. I think equity should be a key part of every conversation we're having in the school, so much as from strategic planning to budgeting, to staffing, to curriculum, to discipline and behavior. So I think that we're doing that work, and I think we have more work to do. I know that's maybe not a full enough answer, but that's what I really believe. Yeah.
Might have an answer here as well, which is to say, like, this is one of the tensions of living in community and having like a priority for people's needs, is to recognize that not everybody has the same needs. And so this is probably 3 weeks ago, and maybe 25 students asked to meet with me, and we're just, essentially a listening session. And so I was taking questions and kind of just taking notes. And, so students were generally speaking to the same theme, but asking for like a whole host of different things that they wanted to see happen. And some of them were like on this end of the spectrum that focused on consequences, and on this end, about learning and growth and change in behavior and how to accomplish that, and not caring what the consequences were, but how do you get real learning and growth to happen, and other conversations about when and where and how this should happen, and which adults in the building should be doing this work. And so just naming that, as I was listening to 25 different students, they had lots of different ideas about what restoration or justice or equity work looks like to them. And so that requires listening on our part, and also it includes tension and balance, and a recognition that we probably can't meet everybody's individual needs all the time, which is why we also say, like, well, what are our community norms? And sometimes, we might be doing some things that support some individuals' needs. And if we can hear, how else somebody else might be served better, like, we can respond to that. So that's, again, why we're having a community forum tonight to talk about, and then to both tonight and in the future, listen about like what is working for people and what isn't working for people. So this just might look like a more robust process to meet more needs in the future.
We are at 7:05. Do we want to do one more question and then save the rest for written?
I think that's probably a good idea, to be respectful to people's time. Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about community in our last question then. Are there specific plans to work towards building and strengthening the sense of community and belonging within GRS? I realize there are academic standards that have to be met, and at the same time, I feel GRS has not offered meaningful opportunities for students to get to know one another before simply launching into getting back to normal after a year and a half of distance learning.
Yes. And it's definitely, you know, I can't say that we've hardly had a leadership meeting that's gone by without being like, man, do we miss not having gone on trips in the fall? Like, you know, there are some key things, key experiences that we missed out on during COVID this fall that I think directly relate to this question, right? Like that's part of the main ways that we do community building. And so we are talking about trips in the spring. We are talking about trips in the winter. We are talking about, you know, creating intentional other opportunities in the context of advisory, in the context of affinity spaces, in the context of clubs and activities, in the context, and you know, in every way that we can think of to try to help build community. And we sorely missed those trips. I think that's an accurate statement to have made. So it's going to take time after many, many months of students being completely removed from the school building and learning in their bedrooms and on iPads and things along those lines. It's going to take some real significant time and real concerted efforts to build community in the way that we really would like to do. Anybody else have any thoughts?
No, it's really like 2 years that we haven't gone on trips too, which is
Yeah.
pretty significant. Like our entire lower adolescent program missed out on quite a bit.
They're a key piece of what we do as a school, and they're so powerful and so important. And so it is, it was a real loss in so many ways, and we know that, we do. I'm definitely going to say that we should wrap up at this point in the evening because it's been, because it is 7:08, as you said, Stacy. We will do our best to get both the answers to the questions as we answered them and also answers to any questions that we didn't answer. We'll try to get that all out and available to you soon. It takes a little while for us to type up and put together, but we'll try to get all of that out as quickly as we can. And if you have other questions, if you have other questions last minute that you'd like to type in Q&A, we'll still get them, or on your way out of the your way out of the webinar, or else you're also always welcome to reach out to us, of course. So please do feel free to reach out to anyone on this team. And Tammy, who wasn't able to be here tonight. So Tammy as well. I hope you all have a good night. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you being here and being this invested in this community. And we are excited about moving forward and looking forward to community building and all the wonderful things that we have ahead of us this year. So thank you again for coming tonight.